Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Picture this. It's a gray, bustling afternoon on a street corner in Paris. You've got the noise of the city everywhere, but right in the middle of the sidewalk, two men are locked in this intense face-off. They come from completely different theological universes. One is a Messianic Jew, a believer in Jesus. The other, an Orthodox Jew named Shlomo. But this isn't a shouting match. It's more like a high-stakes negotiation about the very identity of the Messiah, the validity of Jewish law and the definition of peace itself. It involves arguments about watermelons, medieval philosophers, and a really surprising trade-off at the end with the New Testament and a set of Tefillin.
It is a fascinating scene. I mean, you expect anger, right? Or at least some tension. But what you get is this masterclass in civility. It's like watching a chess match where the pieces are, I don't know, thousands of years of history and the board is a sidewalk in France.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We have the transcript of a video. It's called Messianic and Orthodox Jews Discuss Jesus as Messiah. Our mission is to explore how these two divergent worldviews define the Messiah, how they interpret the Torah, and somehow how they find common ground on the nature of God. But before we get into the heavy theology, a quick request. If you like this channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us out.
You know, getting back to the scene, what strikes me is just the stakes. For both of these men, this isn't some intellectual exercise. It's about the soul. It's about the fate of the entire world.
So let's dive into the core of the disagreement. It really starts with the job description. I mean, if you're hiring for the position of Messiah, what are the qualifications? Because it seems like Shlomo, the Orthodox speaker, has a very specific resume in mind.
He does, and this is really where the divide begins. For Shlomo, you can't just define the Messiah by how you feel or, a personal spiritual experience. He argues that the Messiah is fundamentally a Jewish concept, and it's defined strictly by the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible.
So it's not a vibe, it's a checklist.
Precisely. According to Shlomo, number one, the Messiah is a man, a human being, not a divine entity in the way Christians usually view the Trinity, but a human leader. And his primary role is to bring peace. But he's very specific about what that peace looks like. It isn't just no more war or everyone getting along. It's peace between God and man, and then peace between man and man.
And the mechanism for this peace isn't like the United Nations or some treaty.
No, the mechanism is the Torah. The Messiah restores the rule of Torah in the world. That is the engine that drives the peace.
There was this really vulnerable moment in the conversation, though, where Shlomo talks about the gap between doing and feeling. I found that really striking. He admits that as an Orthodox Jew, they do the mitzvot, the commandments, they put on tefillin, they keep the laws.
Eat kosher, yeah.
Right. But he says they don't always feel the spiritual peace yet.
That is a huge admission to make to someone you're in the middle of a debate with. He's essentially saying there's a disconnect between the, let's say, intellectual or physical act of obedience and the internal spiritual state.
It's almost like he's describing a machine that is running, but the lights aren't fully on yet.
That's a great analogy. He's saying, we have the hardware, the laws, the actions, but the software isn't running perfectly yet. For him, that's where the Messiah comes in. The Messiah is the bridge. The Messiah closes the gap between what they know is true, the law, and what they feel in their hearts. He connects the action to the emotion.
But the Messianic speaker, the guy arguing for Jesus, or Yeshua, as he calls him, he hears this job description about bringing the knowledge of Torah to the world, and he effectively says, hey, look around.
This is what you could call the marketing success argument. And honestly, from a purely objective historical standpoint, it's a strong point. The Messianic speaker points out that if the goal is to bring the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the nations, well, Jesus actually pulled that off.
Yeah, he drops a massive stat on him. He says, there are billions with a B of non-Jews who now believe in the God of Israel because of Jesus. He essentially argues that Jesus took the brand of monotheism, which was a local ethnic religion, and made it global.
Think about it. Before Christianity, the pagan world had no concept of the God of Israel, the Ten Commandments, or the Messiah. The Messianic speaker is arguing that whether or not you agree with the theology, the transmission of that knowledge, the knowledge of one God to the Gentiles, happened through the vehicle of Christianity.
So the Messianic guy is saying, you're waiting for someone to do the job, but the job has already been done on a global scale.
Exactly. He's looking at the result. Shlomo is looking at the process. And this brings us to the second major point of contention, the instruction manual.
Oh, this is where we have to talk about the watermelon.
The watermelon argument. It's a classic piece of Jewish apologetics regarding the oral Torah.
I love this part because it highlights just how different their approach to reading the Bible is. Shlomo is trying to explain why you can't just read the written Torah on its own. He uses the holiday of Sukkot as the example.
Right. The text in Leviticus says to celebrate the holiday with the fruit of a beautiful tree or the fourth species. But it stops there. It doesn't give you a botanical name.
So Shlomo asks the Messianic guy, which species? Is it a watermelon? Is it a strawberry? Is it a lemon? If you just have the text, you might show up to synagogue holding a watermelon.
Which would be awkward.
You would look ridiculous. But his point is serious. Without the oral Torah, the explanation passed down from Moses to the elders to the rabbis, the text is like a locked box. You don't know how to perform the commandments. It's like getting a complex piece of IKEA furniture, but the box contains no pictures and no instructions, just a list of the screws.
It's a compelling argument for the necessity of tradition. It suggests that the text was never meant to stand alone. It was always meant to be read within a community that holds the how-to knowledge.
But the Messianic speaker isn't buying it. He pushes back hard. He says, I've looked, I've searched the Tanakh. I can't find any evidence of this oral Torah.
He takes a strict textual approach. He notes that every time the Bible refers to the law, it seems to be referring to the written scroll. And then he brings up a really sharp historical counterpoint, circumcision.
Oh, this was a good volley. This felt like a tennis match. He says, wait a minute, Abraham performed circumcision way before Moses went up the mountain and got the law. So clearly you can have practices without this formal oral Torah given to Moses at Sinai.
That logic seems sound on the surface. If Abraham did it before the law existed, why do we need the oral law to explain it?
Right. It implies the practice is older than the rule book.
But Shlomo has a riposte ready, and it's a subtle but crucial distinction. He argues that Jews today don't circumcise because of Abraham, they do it because of Moses.
That sounds like splitting hairs. Why does the source matter if the action is the same?
Because in Shlomo's worldview, authority is everything. He points out that in the narrative, Moses actually hesitated to circumcise his own son. He uses that story to prove that even Moses needed specific instruction, the how-to, which implies that there was a specific divine protocol that had to be passed down. It wasn't just a folk custom from Abraham, it was a commanded act with rules.
So Shlomo is saying, we aren't just copying our ancestors like a cultural habit. We are following a specific legal code that requires a legal interpretation.
Correct. It's the difference between tradition as habit and tradition as law.
So you have one guy saying the text is clear enough and the other saying the text is a cryptic code without the key of tradition. And right in the middle of this standoff, they bring in a heavyweight referee, Maimonides.
The Rambam. Moses ben Maimon. He is one of the most prolific and, well, authoritative Torah scholars of the Middle Ages. In the Orthodox world, he is a titan. If Maimonides said it, it's basically settled law.
And initially, Shlomo brings him up to disqualify Jesus, right?
Yes. Maimonides wrote extensively on the laws of kings and the Messiah. He argued specifically that Jesus could not be the Messiah because he did not succeed in the primary mission.
Which goes back to the checklist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did he restore the kingdom of David? No. Did he build the temple? No. Did he establish Torah law? No. In fact, Shlomo notes, his followers historically caused a lot of bloodshed for the Jewish people.
Which is a heavy, painful reality to bring up on a street corner in Paris, a city that has seen its own share of that history. Maimonides essentially said, look at the fruit. If the movement led to persecution of Jews, the leader wasn't the Jewish Messiah.
That is the standard Orthodox position. But then, and this is where I had to rewind the tape to make sure I heard it right, Shlomo admits there's a flip side to Maimonides' view. He quotes Maimonides effectively finding a divine purpose for Christianity.
This is the paradox. And honestly, it's the most surprising part of the whole conversation for me. Why would a strict Orthodox scholar validate a religion he thinks is wrong?
Because Maimonides was a pragmatist. He asked a very simple question. Why did God let Jesus succeed? If he wasn't the Messiah, and if his followers were wrong, why did this movement take over the world? Why did God allow it to flourish?
Shlomo uses this analogy of a company launch. He compares Christianity to a massive startup that went public successfully.
It's a brilliant analogy. Maimonides concluded that even if Jesus wasn't the Messiah, he and Muhammad, later with Islam, served a specific divine purpose. They spread the idea of the one God to the ends of the earth.
So before Christianity, the nations were pagan. They worshipped statues, nature, multiple gods.
Right. And Maimonides argues that Jesus and Muhammad familiarized the pagan world with the concepts of Scripture, with the idea of Messiah, and with the idea of commandments. They essentially prep the audience.
So in Shlomo's view, via Maimonides, Christianity isn't wrong in the sense of being useless. It's a preparatory stage. It's paving the road.
It's playing the long game. The analysis here is that the Orthodox speaker doesn't view the opposing faith as devoid of value. He sees it as a necessary step in history to prepare the playing field for the real Messiah. When the true Messiah comes, Maimonides argues, the nations won't be starting from zero. They will already know the concepts because Christianity and Islam taught them.
That is a surprisingly inclusive view from a theologian who is usually seen as very exclusive. It acknowledges that God is working through history, even in ways that don't fit the strict Orthodox box.
It connects back to that idea of God we touched on earlier. If God is truly the God of the whole world, then history, even the history of other religions, must somehow fit into his plan.
Speaking of plans and the real Messiah, they both have candidates in mind. We know the Messianic speaker is rooting for Jesus, but Shlomo has a specific person in mind too, and he invites the guy to a specific spot to discuss it.
To 17th Street. He's likely referring to a location associated with Shabbat history in Paris. He brings up the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson.
Now, for listeners who might not know, the Rebbe was a massive figure in 20th century Judaism. Shlomo is convinced. He says this man, who prayed and taught there in the 1930s, fits the Messiah standards perfectly.
Even though, and Shlomo admits this, the Rebbe denied being the Messiah during his lifetime. But Shlomo points to his scholarship, his lineage, and his impact on bringing Jews back to Torah. He sees the doing part of the Messiah's job being fulfilled by the Rebbe.
But the Messianic speaker counters with the timeline argument. He pulls out the book of Daniel.
Daniel chapter 9. This is the math problem of biblical prophecy.
Walk us through the math here, because he seems to think this disproves the Rebbe entirely.
So the prophecy in Daniel 9 speaks of the Anointed One, the Messiah being cut off, which most people take to imply death, before the destruction of the city and the sanctuary.
And historically, we know when that happened.
Right. The Second Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. That is a fixed date in history.
So the Messianic speaker's logic is, the deadline was 70 CE.
Exactly. He argues that the Messiah had to appear and be cut off before the temple was destroyed. Since the Rebbe lived in the 20th century, nearly 2,000 years later, he missed the deadline. Jesus, however, died around 30 or 33 CE. He fits that window perfectly.
It's a classic clash of interpretative frameworks. One is looking at personal qualities and adherence to Torah law, the Rebbe. The other is looking at prophetic chronology, the Daniel timeline.
And usually, this is where the conversation hits a wall. You have mutually exclusive facts. You have different candidates. You have different interpretive keys. You'd think they'd just shake hands or maybe roll their eyes and walk away.
But they don't. And this is my favorite part of the source material. The conversation shifts from debate to action. It becomes a trade.
A spiritual negotiation. Shlomo realizes he isn't going to win this guy over with Maimonides quotes or arguments about watermelons. So he switches tactics. He wants to close the deal, but not with a logical point. He wants a physical action.
He asks the Messianic speaker to put on Tefillin.
Right.
For those who haven't seen this, describe what that involves.
Tefillin are these black leather boxes containing scrolls of parchment with Torah verses. You strap one box to your bicep, facing the heart, and the other rests on the forehead just above the eyes. It's a very specific, physical Jewish mitzvah. It binds the intellect and the emotion to the service of God.
And for Shlomo, this is about the soul, isn't it?
Completely. He believes that the soul of this Messianic Jew is a Jewish soul, and that soul needs to connect to God through the physical commandment. It's not about winning the argument. It's about the spiritual welfare of the other person. He thinks, if I can get him to do a mitzvah, that sparks something deep inside him that logic can't touch.
The Messianic speaker agrees. He says, I can do this out of respect, which is interesting in itself. He's willing to engage in the ritual. But he has a counteroffer. He says, I'll do your mitzvah, but I want you to read my book.
The New Testament. But notice specifically where he points him. He doesn't say, read John 3.1. He doesn't say, read the book of Revelation. He says, read the first sentence, Matthew 1.1.
The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
It's an incredibly strategic choice.
Why? It's just a list of names.
Because names are history.
Yeah.
By pointing to the genealogy, he's trying to show Shlomo that this isn't a foreign Gentile book. It doesn't start with a Roman philosophy or a Greek myth. It starts with Abraham. It claims to be a Jewish book written by Jews for Jews. He wants to break down that psychological barrier that says this is not for us.
He's saying, look, this is your family tree too.
Exactly.
So they agree. The Messianic Jew rolls up his sleeve and wraps the leather straps. Shlomo agrees to look at the text. They exchange numbers. They plan to meet before Tuesday, and the video ends with a hug.
And not just a polite, nice to meet you hug. The bystander, or maybe the camera person, captures the mood perfectly. They say, I still have tears of joy in my eyes. We love you so much.
It's really powerful. So let's unpack the so what here. We have two guys who disagree on the identity of the most important figure in human history, according to their worldviews. They disagree on how to read the Bible. They disagree on the timeline of prophecy. Why does it end in a hug?
Because they both recognized the sincerity in the other. It wasn't about scoring points. Shlomo, the Orthodox Jew, values the act, the Tefillin. He wanted to connect the other man to God through action. The Messianic Jew values the text, the New Testament. He wanted to connect Shlomo to God through revelation.
They were both trying to give the other person the best gift they had.
Exactly. In a world where we often try to cancel people for having the wrong opinion, these two were willing to engage in a spiritual trade. They essentially said, I think you're wrong, but I care enough about you to show you what I think is right, and I respect you enough to listen to what you think is right.
And Shlomo's willingness to admit that Christianity has done something good, spreading the knowledge of God, that's a level of nuance you just don't see every day.
It is. And the Messianic speaker's willingness to put on Tefillin to physically engage with the Orthodox tradition shows he's not trying to erase his Jewish identity, but fulfill it.
It goes back to that opening idea of peace. Shlomo said the Messiah's job is to bring peace between man and man. Maybe they didn't settle the theology on that street corner in Paris, but they certainly created a moment of peace.
They bridged the gap. Remember that distinction Shlomo made between knowing the truth and feeling it?
Yeah.
In that hug, in that tearful goodbye, I think they bridged that gap. They moved from abstract theology to a felt sense of brotherhood. They stopped arguing about the definition of peace and actually practiced it.
It's a great reminder. You can stand your ground without burning the bridge.
Absolutely.
Sure.
The bridge is built one conversation at a time.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Both of these men agree that the world is broken and needs a Messiah to fix it. They agree that the goal is peace and connection with the divine. If two people with mutually exclusive theologies, who technically shouldn't even be talking to each other according to some strict interpretations, can end a debate with a hug and a promise to meet again, what excuse do the rest of us have?
That's the question.
Maybe the bridge isn't something we wait for the Messiah to build. Maybe it's something we build while we wait. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.